Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III. Imagine the world in March 1944. We are in Lower Silesia, a region where the winter clings to the earth with a desperate, frozen grip. The air here does not just carry the cold, it seems to be made of it. It is a stillness that feels heavy, pressing against your skin and sinking into your bones. Around us, the forest of Sagan stretches for miles, an endless sea of dark, towering pine trees. Their needles are sharp and silvered with frost, shivering slightly as a biting wind whispers through the canopy. The silence is profound, broken only by the occasional snap of a frozen branch or the distant, rhythmic panting of a steam engine approaching from the west. The soil beneath the forest floor is a secret in itself. If you were to brush away the layer of fallen needles and the thin crust of snow, you would find a startling contrast. This is not the dark, rich loam one might expect in a deep woodland. Instead, it is sand, a fine, shifting sand that is almost startlingly yellow. It is the color of a pale sun or a handful of gold dust, and it behaves more like a liquid than solid ground. In the summer, it kicks up in dry clouds, but in this freezing March, it is a treacherous, icy grit. This sand was the very reason the German Luftwaffe chose this site for their most secure prisoner of war camp. They believed that no man could tunnel through such unstable, brightly colored earth without being caught. As we move deeper into the trees, the smell of resin and damp bark fills the air, mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of the coming snow. Down at the railway station in the town of Sagan, a train has just come to a shuddering halt. It is a massive, soot-stained machine, breathing out great plumes of white steam that vanish into the gray sky. The metal of the carriages groans as it cools, a symphony of pings and clicks that echoes off the small, brick station house. Inside the darkened cars, hundreds of Allied airmen wait. These are the men of the skies, pilots and navigators who, until recently, lived in the clouds. Now, they are about to be introduced to a life of barbed wire and wooden huts. As the heavy doors slide open with a resonant thud, the cold air rushes in, smelling of coal smoke and the vast, indifferent forest. One by one, they step down onto the gravel, their boots crunching in a rhythmic cadence that marks the beginning of their long, uncertain stay. The march from the station to the camp is a somber procession. The men walk in groups, their breath blooming in the air like small, ephemeral ghosts. They are dressed in heavy wool greatcoats, the fabric stiff with the dampness of the journey. To their left and right, the pine trees stand like silent sentinels, blocking out the horizon. There is a sense of being swallowed by the landscape, of being moved into a place that the rest of the world has forgotten. As the trees begin to thin, the first sight of the camp appears. It is a harsh, geometric scar on the natural beauty of the forest. Low-slung wooden barracks are arranged in precise rows, and the entire perimeter is wrapped in miles of double-strand barbed wire that glints like diamonds under the weak afternoon light. It is a world of sharp angles and restricted views. Dominating the perimeter are the watchtowers. Known to the prisoners as goons, the guards stand high above the ground, peering through the glass windows of their wooden boxes. The towers look like giant, long-legged insects perched on the edge of the wire. Below them, the ground is meticulously cleared of all vegetation, leaving only that pale, treacherous sand. This is the no man's land, a space where the shadows of the wire stretch long and thin. The barracks themselves are raised off the ground on small wooden piles, a design meant to allow the guards to look for signs of digging. Every detail of Stalag Luft III was engineered to be a trap. Yet, as the new arrivals are led through the heavy gates, there is a quiet dignity in their stride. They look not at the guards, but at the horizon, where the sun is beginning to set, painting the Silesian sky in bruised shades of purple and deep indigo. Inside the camp, the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke from the small stoves that struggle to fight the March chill. The prisoners who have been here for years, the ones who call themselves Kreegies, watch the newcomers with knowing eyes. They know the routine, the searches, the roll calls, the endless boredom of confinement. But among them, there is also a hidden current of energy. It is a whispered language of codes and secret committees. As the doors of the barracks close for the evening, shutting out the biting wind, the shadows within begin to move. In this place where everything is designed to keep men in, a small group is already looking for a way out. Close your eyes now and listen to the wind in the pines. The story of the Great Escape is just beginning to unfold in the frozen heart of the forest. The air inside the barracks of the North Compound was never truly still. It carried the heavy scent of damp wool, the sharp, metallic tang of illicitly brewed tea, and the low, constant hum of men whispering in a dozen different accents. At the center of this restless hive sat a man whose presence seemed to pull the very shadows toward him. This was Roger Bushell, a South African-born squadron leader with a face that told a story of its own. To his German captors, he was just another prisoner, another pilot grounded by the machinery of war. But to the men of Stalag Luft III, he was something far more formidable. He was known simply as Big X. His most striking feature was his left eye, which carried a permanent, heavy droop, a souvenir of a pre-war skiing accident in the mountains of Switzerland. It gave him a look of constant, intense scrutiny, as if he were perpetually weighing the risks of the world and finding them manageable. Roger Bushell was not a man of half measures. He had been shot down near Dunkirk in 1940 and had already escaped his captors twice, once nearly reaching the Swiss border and another time disappearing into the heart of occupied Prague for months. He was a barrister by trade, a man who understood the intricate logic of rules and, more importantly, how to dismantle them. When he arrived at the camp, he didn't just want to escape. He wanted to orchestrate a masterpiece of defiance. In the spring of 1943, he gathered the escape committee in the flickering yellow light of Hut 104. The men leaned in close, their faces etched with the fatigue of captivity. Bushell did not speak of a small group of 3 or 4 men slipping away into the night. He spoke of an army. He told them that they were all living on borrowed time, and that their only purpose now was to make life a living hell for the enemy. His vision was staggering in its audacity. He proposed that 200 men should break out in a single night. It was a plan designed not just for freedom, but for chaos. He knew that a mass escape of that magnitude would force the Germans to divert tens of thousands of troops, police officers, and resources away from the front lines to conduct a nationwide manhunt. To achieve this, Bushell declared that they would not dig 1 tunnel, but 3. They were given the innocuous names of Tom, Dick, and Harry. The logic was cold and brilliant. If the guards discovered 1 tunnel, they would likely stop looking for others, satisfied that they had crushed the threat. But beneath the sandy soil of the camp, the work would continue in the dark. It was a gamble of unprecedented proportions, requiring the silent cooperation of over 600 prisoners, each playing a vital role in a secret society hidden in plain sight. Under the leadership of Big X, the camp transformed into a clandestine factory. There was a department for everything. In the corners of the drafty huts, the forgers worked with surgical precision. Using stolen nibs, crushed beet juice for ink, and paper scavenged from cigarette packets, they created perfect replicas of German identity cards, travel permits, and work papers. They worked by the light of fatty lamps made from melted margarine tins, their eyes straining as they replicated the complex Gothic script of the Third Reich. Nearby, the tailors were at work, transforming old wool blankets and tattered uniforms into convincing civilian suits. They used needles fashioned from fish bones and thread pulled from the seams of their own clothing. Every button, every lapel, and every stitch had to be perfect. If a man was stopped on a train station platform, a single loose thread could mean the difference between a successful journey and a firing squad. The geography of the camp itself was their greatest enemy. The ground was made of a bright, yellowish sand that sat just beneath a thin layer of gray topsoil. This sand was a death sentence for a tunneler. It was impossible to hide if it was spilled, and it was prone to sudden, terrifying collapses. Bushell's men became masters of concealment. They created the scroungers, men who could talk a guard out of a chocolate bar or a set of pliers, and the stooges, who stood at the windows and in the courtyards, watching the guards with predatory focus. Whenever a guard, known to the prisoners as a goon, approached a hut, a signal would ripple through the camp, a casual whistle or the slamming of a door, and within seconds, the maps, the forgeries, and the entrance to the tunnels would vanish as if they had never existed. The tension was a living thing, a tight cord pulled across the heart of every man involved. As the months of 1943 bled into the cold winter of 1944, the pressure on Roger Bushell intensified. He was the architect of a dream that was becoming a physical reality, foot by painful foot. The tunnels were being dug 30 feet below the surface to avoid the microphones the Germans had buried in the ground. Down there, the air was thin and choked with dust, and the only light came from flickering candles that threatened to go out at any moment. But Bushell remained the steady hand, the voice of authority that kept the men focused. He knew the risk was absolute, and he knew that the eyes of the Gestapo were never far away. He was building more than just a passage through the earth. He was building a legend. And as the tunnels grew longer, stretching toward the dark tree line of the forest beyond the wire, the countdown to the Great Escape had truly begun. To understand the sheer audacity of what was unfolding beneath the feet of the German guards, one must first understand the depth of the challenge. The soil around the camp was a traitor in its own right. On the surface, it was a dark, deceptive gray, but just a few inches down, it turned into a brilliant, unmistakable yellow sand. This sand was the prisoners' greatest enemy and their most persistent burden. To build a tunnel that would lead to freedom, they had to go deep, much deeper than any ordinary escape attempt would dare. 30 feet down into the earth, the air grew cold and heavy, but it was only at this depth that they could hope to evade the sensitive ears of the seismic microphones buried by the Germans along the perimeter. These devices, known as seismographs, were designed to pick up the rhythmic vibrations of a shovel or the soft thud of a falling clump of earth. To bypass them, the men had to sink their shafts vertically, descending into the dark until the sound of their labor would be muffled by the weight of the world above. Roger Bushell, the mastermind they called Big X, knew that one tunnel was a gamble, but 3 tunnels were a strategy. He christened them with the innocuous names of Tom, Dick, and Harry. If the guards discovered one, they might stop looking, satisfied that they had caught the only threat. Tom began its journey in the corner of Hut 123, hidden beneath the shadow of a dark corner. Dick was concealed within the drainage system of the washroom in Hut 122, a place of constant dampness and steam. And Harry, the most ambitious of the 3, found its beginning in Hut 104, tucked away beneath the heavy iron stove that provided the only warmth in the barracks. These were the 3 sisters, born in the dust, stretching their long, sandy fingers toward the distant tree line. Every night, the trapdoors would be lifted with surgical precision, and a lone man would vanish into the floor, leaving behind the world of barbed wire for the world of the deep. The engineering required to dig 30 feet down without the use of heavy machinery was nothing short of a marvel. The prisoners were airmen, not miners, yet they learned the language of the earth by necessity. They had to support the weight of the tunnel with whatever they could scavenge. This led to a quiet, systematic dismantling of the camp's furniture. The most precious resource was wood. Every bunk bed in the compound was held together by slats of timber. One by one, these boards began to disappear. A prisoner might wake up to find his mattress sagging just a little more each week, as his bed slats were taken to shore up the collapsing walls of Harry or Tom. By the time the work was finished, it was estimated that over 4,000 bed boards had been carried into the depths. They were used to create a skeletal frame, a wooden rib cage that held back the relentless pressure of the shifting yellow sand, which threatened to bury the diggers alive with every inch of progress. Inside the tunnels, the space was suffocatingly narrow, barely 2 feet square. A man could not stand or even sit. He could only crawl on his stomach, his shoulders brushing against the rough timber of the shoring. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering light of homemade fat lamps. These lamps were crafted from tiny tins filled with the congealed fat skimmed from the top of the camp's thin mutton soup. Wicks were made from the frayed edges of old blankets or worn-out socks. The air down there was a thick, stagnant soup of its own, smelling of sweat, damp earth, and the acrid smoke of the lamps. Without a constant supply of oxygen, a man would lose consciousness within minutes. This led to the creation of an ingenious ventilation system. They used empty powdered milk containers, known as clim tins, which were supplied by the Red Cross. The prisoners cut the tops and bottoms off these tins and joined them together to form a long, metallic lung that stretched from the surface all the way to the digging face. To move the air through these pipes, they built manual bellows from canvas bags and pieces of broken hockey sticks. A man would sit at the base of the vertical shaft, pumping the bellows rhythmically for hours on end, driving fresh air into the lungs of his comrades deep in the earth. The sound of the pump was a steady, rhythmic thrum, the heartbeat of the escape. As the tunnels grew longer, reaching toward the 100-yard mark, they even installed a rudimentary railway system. Tiny wooden trolleys, with wheels made of wood and metal scraps, were placed on rails. A digger at the far end of the tunnel would fill a box with sand, and then a man at the base of the shaft would pull it back using a long rope. The trolley would click and clack over the uneven tracks, carrying the heavy burden of the earth away from the face. It was a factory of shadows, operating in the middle of the night, fueled by nothing more than the hope of seeing the sun without the crosshairs of a guard tower in the way. But as the tunnels grew, so did the danger of discovery. The volume of sand being removed was staggering, nearly 200 tons of bright yellow earth that had no place in the gray compound. Every bucketful had to be hidden or disposed of without the guards noticing the change in the soil's color. This gave rise to the penguins, men who carried the sand in long, fabric pouches hidden inside their trousers. As they walked around the camp, they would pull a string, allowing the yellow dust to trickle out of their pant legs and into the darker surface soil, where it would be kicked and trodden into the ground. They were walking on the very evidence of their escape, a thin layer of golden dust that represented thousands of hours of backbreaking labor. The engineering of the three sisters was complete, but the earth was beginning to speak, and the Germans were starting to listen more closely than ever before. The winter of 1944 was turning into a game of nerves, played 30 feet below the frost. The struggle against the sand was only one part of a much larger equation. Deep beneath the surface of Stalag Luft III, in the dense darkness that the guards never saw, a new kind of industry was being born. It was a factory of shadows, a place where the air was thick and the light was dim, but the ingenuity was as sharp as a razor. To keep the tunnels breathing and moving, the prisoners needed more than just hands to dig. They needed a pulse. They needed the sound of the forge. This was not a forge of fire and iron in the traditional sense, but a workshop of scrap and desperation. Here, the mundane waste of prison life was transformed into the machinery of freedom. The men moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, their hands dancing over bits of salvaged metal and wood, creating tools that the German engineers had designed the camp to prevent. It was a slow, rhythmic process, a quiet revolution happening just 30 feet below the heavy boots of the guards. The most precious resource in this underground kingdom was a simple tin of powdered milk. The Red Cross sent them in regular packages, labeled with the word clim, which, the men noted with a dry smirk, was simply the word milk spelled backward. To a prisoner, an empty clim can was more valuable than gold. Over 1,400 of these tins were eventually harvested and smuggled into the darkness. In the workshops hidden beneath the floorboards, men became master tinsmiths by necessity. They would carefully cut out the tops and bottoms, then flatten the corrugated cylinders or roll them into long, interlocking tubes. Using a simple wooden mallet and the back of a stolen knife, they crimped the edges together to create airtight seals. You could hear the faint, metallic clicking as they worked, a sound that would have been a death sentence if it had reached the surface. These cans became the veins and arteries of the tunnels. Miles of tin ducting were laid beneath the floor of the shafts, designed to carry life-saving oxygen to the men working hundreds of feet away at the digging face. But the pipes alone were useless without a heart to pump the air. This heart was a contraption born of pure necessity, a bellows-style air pump designed by squadron leader Bob Nelson. It was a strange, beautiful monster of a machine, cobbled together from the wreckage of the prisoners' own meager lives. Its frame was constructed from the sturdy wood of bed pieces and the handles of broken hockey sticks that had been used for recreation. For the bellows themselves, the men used the heavy canvas from old knapsacks and even more of those ubiquitous milk cans. When operated by a man like Ivor Harris, who spent hours in the cramped, stifling pump room at the base of the shaft, the bellows would expand and contract with a rhythmic, ghostly wheeze. With every heavy stroke, it forced a fresh breeze through the tin pipes, pushing away the suffocating heat and the rank smell of sweat that pooled at the end of the tunnel. The pumpers worked in total darkness, guided only by the feeling of the wooden handle and the resistance of the air, their lungs burning as they provided breath for those further in the earth. As the tunnels of Tom, Dick, and Harry stretched further toward the distant woods, the problem of distance became a physical weight. Carrying buckets of sand back to the entrance by hand was becoming impossible in the narrow, 2-foot square passage. And so, the engineers of the North Compound built a railway. It was a marvel of miniature engineering. They used more bed boards to create long, straight tracks that ran the length of the floor, shimmed with small pieces of wood to keep them level against the shifting sand. On these tracks sat wooden trolleys with flanged wheels, carved with agonizing precision from scraps of hardwood. They even built halfway houses, widened sections of the tunnel where 2 trolleys could pass each other, or where a tired digger could press himself against the wall to let the sand-laden carts go by. The sound of the wheels clicking over the wooden joints became the heartbeat of the excavation, a low, rumbling thunder that vibrated through the floor of the hut above, masked only by the deliberate noise of the prisoners living their daily lives. The workshops also produced the light that kept the crushing darkness at bay. In the beginning, they relied on fat lamps, tiny tins filled with mutton fat skimmed from their meager evening soup, with wicks made from the frayed cotton cords of old pajamas. The smell was horrendous, a thick, oily smoke that scorched the throat and filled the small tunnel with a heavy, gray haze. But as 1944 approached, the ingenuity turned to more daring methods. They began to steal from the enemy. When German workmen came into the camp to perform repairs, the prisoners would wait for a single moment of distraction to spirit away lengths of copper wire. These wires were then spliced into the camp's own electrical grid. Suddenly, the tunnels were bathed in the steady, golden glow of electric light. It was a luxury that made the underground feel less like a grave and more like a passage to the future. The sight of a single, glowing bulb reflecting off the yellow sand gave the men a sense of power that no prison wall could contain. In these workshops, the prisoners were no longer just captives. They were craftsmen of the impossible. Every scoop made from a scrap of metal, every candle holder, and every piece of shoring was a small, quiet act of defiance against their captors. The sound of the forge was the sound of men refusing to be broken by the wire and the cold Silesian winter. It was the sound of clicking tin, the soft rasp of a wooden plane, and the steady, rhythmic breath of the bellows. Beneath the feet of the unsuspecting guards, an entire industrial revolution was taking place in the dark. The tools grew more refined every day, and with them, the pace of the digging quickened. The woods were calling, and the machines they had built from trash were finally ready to take them there. The tunnel was no longer just a hole in the ground. It was a living, breathing machine, waiting for the night it would finally reach the trees. The air in the hidden corners of the barracks grew heavy with the scent of wood smoke and something sharper, more chemical. While the tunnels deepened, a different kind of precision was unfolding in the shadows of the compound. This was the domain of the artists and the mimics, a secret department known among the prisoners as Dean and Dawson. Here, men who had once been architects, draftsmen, or illustrators bent over makeshift desks, their eyes strained by the flickering light of fat lamps. They were not building with timber or iron, but with the fragile weight of paper and ink. Every man who intended to step out of that tunnel needed more than just a head start. He needed a new soul, a paper identity that could withstand the cold, piercing gaze of a German inspector. In this quiet sanctuary of subversion, the prisoners were rewriting their destinies, one stroke of a pen at a time. To create a convincing forgery in the middle of a prisoner of war camp required a level of ingenuity that bordered on the miraculous. They had no printing presses, no specialized dyes, and certainly no official stamps. Instead, they looked to their own boots. The rubber heels of their shoes were sacrificed, carefully sliced away with razor blades that had been honed to a lethal sharpness on the edge of a stone. With the steady hands of surgeons, the forgers carved into the rubber mirrors of official Reich seals and eagle emblems. One slip of the blade, a single millimeter too deep, and the stamp would be ruined, a telltale blur that could cost a man his life. They used soap, too, carving intricate patterns into the dry bars provided by the Red Cross, then hardening them to create temporary stamps that could replicate the complex watermarks of the German state. Every indentation was a prayer for safe passage. The ink was perhaps the greatest triumph of their desperation. Real ink was a luxury they could rarely steal, so they became alchemists. They gathered soot from the stoves, scraping the black carbon from the chimneys and mixing it with a few drops of precious oil or grease to create a viscous, dark fluid. For the blue and red markings of the travel permits, they turned to the earth and the mess hall. They crushed dried berries found near the perimeter fences, straining the juice through scrap fabric to catch the deep pigments. Even cold tea was used to age the paper, giving crisp, white sheets from library books a weathered, yellowed appearance that suggested years of travel in a pocket. They mixed these concoctions in small tins, testing the consistency on scraps of wood, ensuring that the color would not run or fade when exposed to the dampness of the German night. Then there were the maps. Every escapee required a guide through the labyrinth of the German countryside, and the forgery team produced them by the thousands. They utilized a primitive but effective method of duplication called a hectograph. They would take gelatin from their food parcels, melt it down, and pour it into a shallow tray to set. By drawing a master map with a special, highly concentrated ink made from crushed pencil leads and sugar, they could press the master onto the cool gelatin surface. The jelly would absorb the image, and for a brief window of time, it could act as a plate, allowing them to press dozens of clean sheets against it to pull away a purple-tinted copy. Each map was a masterpiece of miniature detail, showing railway lines, mountain passes, and forbidden zones, all rendered on paper so thin it could be rolled into a cigarette or hidden in the lining of a coat. The work was exhausting, demanding a focus that blocked out the hunger and the constant fear of discovery. A forger might spend 5 hours on a single signature, practicing the fluid, authoritarian loops of a specific German officer, until his hand moved with the same muscle memory as the man he was impersonating. They studied the German Fraktur script until every sharp angle and heavy downward stroke was perfect. These documents, the Ausweis and the identity cards, were the final barrier. They were the thin shields of paper that would have to protect 200 men from the machinery of a nation at war. As the pile of forged papers grew, hidden in the hollowed-out legs of tables or behind false walls, the weight of the responsibility settled over the workroom. They were not just drawing lines. They were drawing the path to freedom, and the ink was still wet as the date of the escape drew near. The greatest enemy of the men at Stalag Luft III was not always the wire or the guards in the towers. Often, it was the very ground beneath their feet. To the casual observer, the camp was a landscape of drab, dusty gray. The surface soil was a thin, humic layer of dark earth and pine needles. But just a few inches below that veneer lay a geological betrayal. The subsoil of the Polish forest was a vibrant, startling yellow sand. It was a color that did not belong in the sunlight. It was coarse, glacio-fluvial sediment that, when brought to the surface, acted like a beacon. If even a handful of this golden grit was left on the dark gray topsoil, it could be seen from the guard towers or by the sharp eyes of a passing patrol. For the tunnel engineers, every inch of progress deep in the earth created a secondary, more terrifying problem above. They were creating mountains of evidence, tons of bright yellow sand that had to vanish into thin air. The solution to this problem was a quiet, rhythmic operation known as the Penguin's Secret. It required a specific kind of ingenuity and an even greater measure of courage. The prisoners began by crafting long, tubular bags from the materials they had at hand. Often, they would sacrifice a pair of thick wool socks, or perhaps use segments of old towels stitched together with stolen thread. These bags were suspended inside the men's trousers, hanging down along the inner thighs. They were held in place by a length of material looped around the neck or fastened to the waist. At the bottom of each bag, a simple but effective mechanism was installed. A small pin, attached to a string that ran up into the man's pocket, kept the bottom of the bag tightly pinched. When the string was pulled, the pin would release, and the sand would trickle out of the trouser leg like water from a tap. The men who volunteered for this duty were called the Penguins. The name was not merely a joke. It was a description of their physical reality. Each bag could hold several pounds of heavy, damp sand. When fully loaded, the weight would pull at their clothes and change the way they moved. Their legs were forced apart by the bulk of the hidden bags, and their gait became a slow, stiff-legged waddle. Imagine the tension of stepping out into the compound, the heavy sand pressing against your skin, knowing that a single tear in the fabric or a loose string could leave a golden trail behind you. Every step was a performance. They had to look casual, as if they were merely taking the air or heading to the library, while carrying the weight of the tunnel between their knees. The psychological toll was immense. They walked with their hands in their pockets, fingers twitching on the release strings, eyes scanning the perimeter for the men they called the ferrets. Dispersing the sand required a delicate choreography. The Penguins would gravitate toward areas where the soil had already been disturbed. The small vegetable gardens, where prisoners grew meager patches of tomatoes or lettuce, were ideal. A penguin would pause by a garden bed, perhaps leaning down to inspect a leaf or to speak quietly to a friend. Inside his pocket, a silent tug of the string would open the bags. As he stood and walked away, the yellow sand would spill out, falling onto the dark earth. Then came the most important part of the ritual, the shuffle. Using the side of his boot, the penguin would gently kick and scuff the ground, mixing the bright subsoil into the dark gray surface until the two became one. During the warmer months, they would even use blankets. They would walk to a sunny spot, spread a blanket for a rest, and let the sand drain out underneath it before folding the blanket back up, leaving the evidence buried beneath the dust. The danger was ever present in the form of the German security guards, the ferrets, who were trained to look for exactly this kind of deception. These guards would crawl under the huts with long metal probes, searching for soft spots in the earth. They watched the prisoners for any sign of unusual behavior. One afternoon, a penguin was walking across the compound when a bag suddenly snagged and tore. A thin, bright yellow line began to draw itself across the dark ground behind him. It was a moment of pure, cold terror. The ferrets noticed the trail, and though they did not immediately find the tunnel called Harry, the discovery heightened the tension throughout the camp. It was a reminder that the secret was fragile. The penguins were moving more than just Earth. They were moving the hope of the entire camp, one pocketful at a time, under the very noses of their captors. By the time the tunnel was nearing completion, it is estimated that the penguins had made over 25,000 individual trips. More than 200 men took part in this silent, exhausting relay. They moved over 100 tons of sand. Think of the sheer repetition of it, the filling of the socks, the heavy walk, the release, the scuffing of the dirt, and the return to the dark shadows of the huts to do it all over again. It was a labor of thousands of hours, performed in the open air, under the watchful gaze of machine guns and searchlights. The yellow sand was a heavy burden, but the penguins carried it with a quiet, shuffling dignity. Their secret remained buried in the gardens and under the floors, a golden foundation for the escape that was slowly stretching its way toward the distant trees of the German forest. The late summer of 1943 arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that seemed to settle over the pine forests surrounding the camp. Inside the wire of the North Compound, life was a constant, rhythmic performance of normalcy designed to mask the feverish industry beneath the soil. Every man had a role, and every role was a thread in a tapestry of deception. The air was thick with the scent of resin and the fine, pervasive dust of the Silesian earth. For months, the three tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, had been growing like veins through the ground, but it was Tom that had become the focus of their greatest hopes. The tunnel was long, reaching out toward the tree line, nearly touching the sanctuary of the shadows. But as the days grew shorter and the light turned golden in September, a shadow of a different kind began to lengthen across Hut 123. The tension among the men was no longer a dull hum. It was a sharp, vibrating frequency that made every footstep on the floorboards sound like a hammer strike. Among the prisoners, the guards were known as goons, but the most dangerous of them were the ferrets. These were the specialists, men in gray-blue overalls who spent their entire existence looking for the impossible. They carried long, thin metal probes and moved through the huts with a predatory patience. They were trained to listen for the hollow ring of a floorboard and to watch for the smallest dusting of bright, yellow sand that didn't belong on the surface. For weeks, a subtle game of cat and mouse had been playing out. The prisoners would create distractions, staging elaborate arguments or impromptu football matches to draw the ferrets away from the sensitive areas. But the ferrets were beginning to suspect that something massive was unfolding. They had noticed the subtle changes in the ground level around the compound, and the strange, persistent way the prisoners seemed to congregate in specific huts. The atmosphere was a powder keg, waiting for a single spark of a metal rod to ignite it. The breaking point came on the 8th of September, 1943. It started as a routine inspection, the kind the men had endured 100 times before. The guards entered Hut 123 with a focused intensity. They had seen something, perhaps a stray grain of sand caught in a trouser cuff, or a nervous glance from a lookout that lasted a second too long. As the prisoners stood by their bunks, hearts hammering against their ribs, the ferrets began to probe the area around the great masonry chimney. This was the heart of Tom. The entrance was a masterpiece of engineering, hidden beneath a heavy concrete base and a cast-iron stove that appeared immovable. To any casual observer, it was solid, permanent, and utterly unremarkable. But the ferrets were no longer casual. They were looking for the seams in the world the prisoners had built. They moved the stove with a grunt of effort, their eyes scanning the floor with a cold, professional curiosity. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight. One guard knelt by the base of the chimney, his breath ragged in the quiet air. He held a metal spike, a slender tool of discovery. He began to tap. At first, there was only the dull thud of solid brick and earth. But then, as he moved the spike toward the corner of the concrete slab, the sound changed. It became a hollow, echoing ring. The guard froze. He tapped again, and the sound confirmed the nightmare. Beneath the feet of the men stood a void. With a cry of triumph that pierced the heavy atmosphere, the guard signaled to his comrades. They began to pry at the edges of the slab, their fingers catching on the carefully concealed seams. As the trapdoor was finally forced open, a dark, cool draft of air rose from the depths, smelling of damp earth and wood. Tom had been found. The secret that hundreds of men had guarded with their lives was laid bare in the flickering light of a German torch. The reaction from the camp authorities was swift and devastating. They didn't just close the tunnel, they sought to erase it. The prisoners watched from the windows of their huts as the guards brought in heavy equipment and explosives. The destruction of Tom was a spectacle of power. When the charges were detonated, the ground shook with a low, mournful rumble, and a plume of dust erupted from the chimney of Hut 123. The tunnel, which had been a symbol of hope and a monument to thousands of hours of silent, agonizing labor, was collapsed into a jagged trench of broken timber and yellow sand. For the men who had dug it, the loss was visceral. They had spent months in the dark, breathing stale air and moving earth by the handful, only to see it vanished in a single afternoon. The mood in the compound turned somber, the weight of the failure pressing down on every man. The guards were now emboldened, their vigilance doubling as they realized just how close the prisoners had come to the forest edge. In the wake of the discovery, the Germans moved to shatter the cohesion of the escape organization. They believed the Americans and the British were collaborating too effectively, and so a decision was made to relocate the American prisoners to a separate compound. This forced separation was a tactical blow, tearing apart teams that had worked in unison for months. Security was tightened to an unprecedented level. New microphones were sunk deeper into the earth, and the number of patrols increased until the compound felt like a cage within a cage. Yet, amidst the ruins of Tom and the departure of their comrades, a quiet, defiant resolve began to take hold. The tunnel named Dick was abandoned for digging and repurposed as a massive storage locker for sand and supplies. All eyes and all remaining hope turned to the third and final tunnel, Harry. The discovery of Tom was not the end of the story. It was a brutal lesson that sharpened their focus. As the winter of 1943 approached, the work on Harry was suspended, waiting for the cover of the long, dark nights of the coming year. The atmosphere within the North Compound had reached a brittle, electric stillness by the early months of 1944. While the German guards, those sharp-eyed ferrets, believed they had successfully dampened the spirits of the prisoners by moving the most suspicious officers to other camps, they had inadvertently sharpened the focus of those who remained. The scattered efforts of the past were now funneled into a single, desperate hope. All eyes, though carefully hooded, were turned toward Hut 104. Inside this unassuming wooden structure, the air always seemed a little thicker, a little more laden with the scent of wood smoke and unwashed wool. It was here that the final pulse of the great plan beat, hidden beneath the very floorboards where the men slept and shared their meager rations. The focus had shifted entirely to the tunnel they called Harry, a name that felt almost like a living companion to the men who risked everything to breathe life into its dark, narrow throat. At the heart of Hut 104 sat a heavy, cast-iron heating stove. To an casual observer or a patrolling guard, it was merely a source of warmth in the bitter Silesian winter. But this stove was a masterpiece of deception. The prisoners had meticulously rebuilt its concrete base, a task of immense risk performed under the constant threat of discovery. They fashioned a wooden frame and a concrete tray into which the floor tiles were reset with such precision that the seams were invisible to the naked eye. This entire assembly acted as a massive, hinged trapdoor. To further discourage the guards from lingering near the site, the prisoners kept the stove burning almost constantly. The radiant heat served as a physical barrier. A guard was unlikely to press his hands against a blistering iron surface or peer too closely at the floor beneath a roaring fire. When it was time to work, the stove would be slid aside on a clever mechanism, and the trapdoor would be lifted, revealing the yawning mouth of the entrance shaft. Dropping down into that shaft was like leaving the world of the living behind. A vertical drop of 30 feet awaited the diggers, a descent into a cool, damp silence that smelled of ancient, compressed sand. At the bottom, the world contracted until it was only 2 feet wide and 2 feet high. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of the earth above you. 30 feet of heavy, shifting soil pressing down on a space barely large enough to crawl through. The men who worked here did so in a state of near-total sensory deprivation. Because the tunnel was so cramped, many chose to work entirely naked or in their thin underwear, not out of comfort, but out of a desperate need to keep their clothes clean. Even a few grains of the bright, telltale yellow sand caught in the threads of a tunic could lead a man to the cooler, or worse. They moved like ghosts through the earth, their skin slick with sweat and grit, their muscles screaming from the effort of twisting in a space that offered no room to turn around. The engineering of Harry was a triumph of scavenged materials. Every inch of the 2-foot square passage had to be shored up to prevent a catastrophic cave-in. The walls and ceiling were lined with bed boards, the narrow slats of wood taken from the prisoners' own bunks. By the time the tunnel reached its full length, thousands of these boards had been spirited away, leaving the men above to sleep on precariously thin supports. The sound of the shoring was a constant, unsettling companion. The wood would groan and creak under the pressure of the earth, a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and a sandy grave. To provide air to the workers deep in the face of the tunnel, an ingenious ventilation system was devised. They used empty powdered milk tins, known as clim tins, stripping the ends and soldering them together with melted lead from window frames to create long, winding pipelines. A handmade bellows, operated by a man sitting in a small chamber at the base of the shaft, pumped fresh air through these tin veins, providing the literal breath of life to the digger at the far end. Progress was measured in inches and agonizing hours. A good day might see the tunnel advance 7 or 8 feet, but every foot required the removal of tons of soil. This sand was the enemy. It was a brilliant, vivid yellow, a stark contrast to the dark, gray topsoil of the camp. The diggers would fill small wooden trolleys that ran on makeshift rails made of bed slats, pulling the heavy loads back toward the shaft with ropes. Every time a trolley moved, the air grew thick with dust, clogging the lungs and stinging the eyes. The claustrophobia was not just a physical sensation, it was a mental weight that sat heavy on the chest. To be 30 feet underground, in a lightless hole where you could not even sit upright, required a level of mental fortitude that is difficult to fathom. They worked by the flickering light of mutton fat lamps, the smell of burning grease mixing with the scent of damp earth and human effort, all while the hidden pulse of Hut 104 beat on, steady and defiant, toward the distant tree line. The atmosphere in the compound shifted as dusk fell on the 24th of March, 1944. A moonless night was supposed to be their greatest ally, but the weather had turned into a bitter enemy. A thick blanket of snow lay across the grounds of Stalag Luft III, and the temperature had plummeted far below freezing. In Hut 104, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed wool, nervous sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of forged documents. The men who had been selected for the first wave of the escape were gathered, their pockets stuffed with concentrated food rations and maps drawn on silk. They sat in the shadows, speaking only in whispers, the tension so heavy it felt as though the wooden walls might buckle under the weight of their anticipation. The first major obstacle arrived before a single man had even entered the shaft. When the team designated to open the trapdoor moved the heavy iron stove, they found a nightmare. The moisture from the breath of hundreds of men and the dampness of the earth had frozen solid around the edges of the concrete and brick frame. The door was seized shut. For 90 agonizing minutes, they worked in the dark, chipping away at the ice with small hand tools, their hearts hammering against their ribs every time a guard's boots crunched on the snow outside. Every minute lost was a minute of darkness they could never get back. Finally, with a muffled groan of wood and metal, the hatch gave way, revealing the dark, vertical drop into the throat of the tunnel they called Harry. One by one, the first group of escapees descended the 30-foot shaft. The transition from the biting cold of the hut to the suffocating, humid air of the tunnel was jarring. Harry was a narrow, wooden-ribbed throat of a passage barely 2 feet square. To move through it, the men lay on small wooden trolleys, pulling themselves along a makeshift rail system by a rope. Above them, the weight of the German Reich pressed down in the form of 9 meters of sandy earth. The only light came from dim, flickering bulbs powered by stolen electricity, casting long, dancing shadows against the bedboard walls. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic thud of the air pump and the soft scrape of the trolleys. It was a journey of over 300 feet through a dark, wooden womb, leading toward a promise of freedom that felt increasingly fragile. At the far end of the tunnel, near the exit shaft, Johnny Bull waited. He was the shift boss, the man tasked with the final breakthrough. He climbed the wooden rungs of the exit ladder, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He began to dig through the final 2 feet of earth that separated them from the surface. When his shovel finally broke through, a rush of icy, fresh air flooded the tunnel, a sensation so sweet it almost brought him to tears. But as he pushed his head through the opening and peered out into the night, his heart stopped. He was not in the thick cover of the pine forest. He was in the open, the dark gray of the snow-covered ground illuminated by the distant, sweeping arc of a searchlight. The calculations had been off. Perhaps the tunnel had curved slightly during the long months of blind digging, or perhaps the distance to the tree line had been misjudged in the frantic, secret surveys of the previous year. Regardless of the cause, the exit hole was 20 feet short of the woods. It sat in a strip of no man's land, dangerously close to the perimeter fence. Even worse, it was a mere 45 feet away from a guard tower, known to the prisoners as a goon box. From that height, a sentry looking down would have a clear view of any man emerging from the earth. The snow made it even worse. The dark figures of the men would stand out like ink blots on white parchment. Word of the shortfall traveled back through the tunnel like an electric shock. When it reached Roger Bushell, the mastermind known as Big X, a heavy silence fell over the leaders. They were nearly 2 hours behind schedule because of the frozen hatch, and now their exit was a trap. Many argued for calling it off, but Bushell knew this was their only chance. The Gestapo was closing in, and the tunnel would surely be found if they waited for another moonless night. He gave the order that would change everything. They would go. But the pace would have to be agonizingly slow. They would use a long rope as a signal line, extending from the woods back down into the tunnel. A man in the trees would tug the rope only when the sentries were looking away, signaling the next person to emerge and crawl for their life. The escape began with a crawl through the frozen slush. The first man emerged, his dark civilian suit a stark contrast to the white ground. He waited for the tug on the rope, then slithered toward the trees, his belly dragging through the snow. Every few seconds, the great eye of the searchlight passed over the area, and he would freeze, praying that the guards would mistake his still form for a patch of shadows. It was a game of life and death played in slow motion. Back in the tunnel, dozens of men waited in the damp darkness, their bodies cramped and shivering, listening to the muffled sounds of the world above. They were no longer just prisoners. They were shadows moving through a frozen landscape, each one carrying the weight of years of longing. The night of the frozen ground had begun, and there was no turning back. Deep beneath the frozen crust of the camp, the tunnel named Harry had become a rhythmic, living thing. It was a narrow vein of hope, 30 feet below the surface, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the resinous tang of 4,000 bedboards. The men inside moved with a practiced, agonizing slowness. In the darkness, the only constant was the steady, mechanical wheeze of the handmade bellows in the air pump room. A single man sat there, hour after hour, pumping fresh oxygen through a pipeline of connected milk tins so that those deep in the shaft could breathe. The heat down there was stifling, a stark contrast to the biting Polish winter waiting above. Every man was drenched in a cold sweat, his civilian suit, painstakingly fashioned from blankets and old uniforms, now caked in the pale yellow sand that defined this landscape. They were no longer soldiers in their own minds. They were shadows, waiting for their turn on the wooden trolley. The trolley system was a masterpiece of desperate engineering. It was a small wooden platform on wheels, pulled back and forth along a track by a length of rope. As each man lay flat on the boards, his heart hammering against the wood, he was pulled through the darkness toward the exit shaft. The journey was 102 meters of claustrophobic silence, broken only by the muffled clatter of wheels on the pine rails. Above them, the camp was a world of searchlights and frozen wire, but down here, there was only the rope. At the exit, a simple piece of twine acted as their lifeline to the surface. One tug meant the coast was clear, 2 meant a guard was near, and they must remain frozen in the depths. The man at the top of the shaft stood in a tiny pocket of air, his head just inches below the snow, watching the boots of the sentries through a thin layer of brush and ice. The tension was a physical weight, heavier than the earth itself. Around midnight, the night took an even darker turn. An air raid siren wailed in the distance, and the camp's electrical grid was severed. Suddenly, the dim light bulbs that had illuminated the tunnel flickered and died. The men were plunged into a total, suffocating blackness. For over an hour, the escape ground to a halt as they waited in the belly of the earth, unable to move for fear of a collapse or a misstep. In that silence, the cold began to seep down the shaft. They could hear the wind howling above, a reminder of the brutal landscape they were about to enter. When the lights finally surged back to life, the pace was frantic but cautious. They had intended to send 200 men through, but the night was slipping away. The tunnel exit had fallen 30 feet short of the protective tree line, meaning every man had to crawl across open, snow-covered ground to reach the safety of the pines. Each second spent in the open was a gamble with death. By 3 a.m, the number of escapees began to climb. 40, 50, 60. They emerged from the hole like ghosts rising from the grave, their breath hitching in the sub-zero air. Each man would climb the vertical ladder, his frozen fingers gripping the rungs, and pull himself into the night. The steam from the tunnel, heated by the bodies below, rose in a faint, traitorous column from the exit hole, visible against the dark woods. They had to be quick. They had to be silent. The snow was crisp and loud under their boots, a terrifying sound that seemed to echo for miles. They moved toward the trees, following the guide rope, their eyes fixed on the shadows where their freedom began. Some carried small suitcases filled with forged maps and concentrated chocolate rations. Others carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and a compass hidden in a button. They were becoming a scattered trail of 76 ghosts, dissolving into the German night. As the clock ticked toward 5 a.m, the horizon began to bleed a faint, pale gray. The darkness that had been their shield was dissolving. The 76th man had just cleared the hole and vanished into the brush when the world finally shattered. A German guard, Charlie Simat, was making his final rounds near the perimeter. In the dim, pre-dawn light, he noticed something unusual, a dark shape moving where there should be only white snow. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the ice, unaware that he was standing mere feet from the exit of Tunnel Harry. At that moment, the 77th man was halfway out of the shaft. The guard's eyes widened as he saw the steam, the disturbed earth, and the human head emerging from the ground. He reached for his rifle, the cold metal biting into his palms, and let out a shout that broke the silence of the forest. A single shot rang out, echoing through the camp, signaling that the great journey was over and the hunt had begun. The morning of March 25th, 1944, arrived with a deceptive stillness. At Stalag Luft III, the discovery of the tunnel known as Harry sent a ripple of absolute panic through the compound guards. The silence of the pine forest was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic blowing of whistles and the frantic barking of dogs. As the sun climbed higher, the German authorities realized the scale of the breach. 76 men had vanished into the night, slipping through a hole in the earth that was never supposed to exist. The air in the camp grew heavy with a new kind of tension, a mixture of pride from the remaining prisoners and a simmering, dangerous fury from the commandant and his staff. Outside the wire, the great machinery of the Third Reich began to grind into gear, turning its immense, cold focus toward the men now scattered across the countryside. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A national alert, known as a Großfahndung, was declared. This was not merely a local search. It was a total mobilization of the state's internal security forces. Imagine, if you will, the maps of Germany being laid out on heavy wooden tables, the red ink of the search perimeters expanding with every passing hour. Nearly 100,000 men were diverted from the war effort to participate in the hunt. Members of the Gestapo, the Kriminalpolizei, the SS, and even the local Home Guard were ordered to scour every forest, every barn, and every village. The Reich was in turmoil, embarrassed by the audacity of the airmen, and the hunt became a matter of national prestige. For the escapees, the world had suddenly become a very small, very hostile place, where every shadow held a potential captor. The weather was a brutal enemy in its own right. The spring of 1944 was late, and the German countryside remained locked in a freezing embrace. Snow lay thick on the ground, and the air carried a biting chill that seeped through the layers of civilian clothing the men had so carefully fashioned from blankets and scraps. Many of the escapees found themselves wading through thigh-deep drifts, their boots sodden and their fingers numbing. They moved like ghosts through the trees, listening to the distant, haunting sound of sirens echoing across the valleys. The physical toll was immense. Every snapping twig felt like a gunshot, and every distant light was a reminder that they were strangers in a land that was now looking for them with a singular, terrifying intensity. The railway stations became the most dangerous stages of all. Many of the men had intended to travel by train, hoping their forged papers and practiced accents would see them through. Picture the scene at the station in Sagan. The smell of coal smoke, the hiss of steam from the massive locomotives, and the flickering yellow light of the lanterns. The escapees sat on benches, clutching their small suitcases, trying to look like ordinary laborers or businessmen. But the Großfahndung had changed the rules. At every platform, the Kriminalpolizei stood waiting, their eyes scanning the crowds for any sign of hesitation. They checked documents with a meticulous, slow-motion precision. For many of the 76, the journey ended right there, on a cold platform under the watchful gaze of a man in a long leather coat who noticed a slight error in a forged signature or a nervous twitch in a traveler's hands. As the days passed, the net began to tighten. One by one, and in small groups of 2 or 3, the airmen were intercepted. Some were found sleeping in haylofts, their bodies exhausted beyond the point of flight. Others were caught near the borders of Czechoslovakia or Switzerland, just miles from the freedom they had risked everything to find. Those who were captured were often taken to local police stations or Gestapo headquarters, such as the jail at Gorlitz. The atmosphere in these places was stark and intimidating. The walls were damp, and the sound of iron doors clanging shut signaled the end of their brief taste of liberty. Of the 76 who had crawled through the tunnel, 73 would eventually find themselves back in custody, their faces worn by the elements, but their spirits still defiant. But this was no longer a standard military capture. In Berlin, the news of the mass escape had reached the highest levels of the Nazi leadership, and the reaction was one of pure, unadulterated rage. Adolf Hitler, incensed by the disruption during such a critical period of the war, issued a directive that would later be known as the Sagan Order. He demanded that as a deterrent, more than half of the recaptured men should be executed. This was a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention, a descent into a darkness that even the Luftwaffe generals found difficult to stomach. The 73 prisoners, held in various cells across the Reich, had no idea that their fate was being decided not by military law, but by the vengeful whims of a regime in its final, most desperate stages. As the month of March drew to a close, the massive manhunt wound down, having achieved its grim objective. Only 3 men had truly slipped through the net, making their way toward the neutral territories of Sweden and Spain. For the others, the journey had led back to the shadows. The Reich remained in turmoil, a nation on edge, watching its borders and its people with increasing suspicion. The escapees sat in their cells, listening to the wind outside, unaware that the real tragedy of the Great Escape was only just beginning. The courage they had shown in the tunnel was about to be met with a level of brutality that the world would never forget. We pause here, in the cold quiet of the German spring, as the shadows of history prepare to lengthen. The spring of 1944 arrived with a deceptive softness in the forests of Silesia. The snow was retreating, leaving behind a damp, earthy scent that clung to the pine needles and the heavy coats of the men who still roamed the countryside. But for the 73 recaptured escapees of Stalag Luft III, the air was thickening with a danger that surpassed the walls of any prison. In the corridors of power far from the camp, a dark command had been issued. It was an order that would forever stain the history of the war, known to the shadows as the Sagan Order. Adolf Hitler, incensed by the sheer scale of the breakout and the embarrassment it caused the Third Reich, had initially demanded that every single man who had stepped through the mouth of the tunnel be executed. His advisors, fearful of the repercussions for their own captured pilots, pleaded for a different course. Eventually, a grim compromise was reached. 50 men would be chosen to die. 50 souls would be sacrificed to serve as a deterrent for those who still dreamed of the sky and the freedom beyond the wire. The selection was not made by the Luftwaffe, who had maintained a level of military respect for their prisoners. Instead, the task was handed to the Gestapo and the Kriminalpolizei. Under the direction of Arthur Neeb, the list of names began to take shape. It was a cold, bureaucratic process, choosing who would live and who would be silenced forever. Among those selected was the mastermind himself, Roger Bushell. As the list was finalized, the logistics of murder were put into motion. The men were moved in small groups, often only 2 or 3 at a time, away from the local jails and towards what they believed were more permanent transit camps. They were told they were being returned to the familiar confines of Stalag Luft III. They climbed into the back of dark, heavy motor cars, perhaps feeling a sense of relief that the hunt was over and the safety of the camp was within reach. They could not have known that the roads they traveled were leading only to the silence of the forest floor. The mechanics of the executions were chillingly consistent. The cars would rumble down lonely stretches of highway, the engines the only sound in the vast, quiet landscape. Suddenly, the driver would pull over, claiming the vehicle required water, or that the prisoners were allowed a brief moment to stretch their legs and relieve themselves in the brush. As the airmen stepped into the light of day, often squinting against the sun or shivering in the breeze, they were shot from behind. The Gestapo agents used pistols and machine pistols, firing at close range to ensure the end was swift. There were no witnesses but the trees. In the aftermath, the bodies were not buried in marked graves. They were taken to local crematoria in places like Danzig, Breslau, and Munich, where their identities were obscured by the flames. The order was clear. Their remains were to be reduced to ash, and only then would their fate be whispered back to the comrades they had left behind in the North Compound. Back at the camp, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, pulsing anxiety. The prisoners had heard rumors of the massive manhunt, but they held on to the hope that their friends were simply being processed through the system. On the 6th of April, 1944, that hope was shattered. The new camp commandant, a man named Oberst Cords, called the senior British officer into his office. There were no handshakes, no usual military courtesies. In a voice that betrayed the weight of the news, he announced that 41 of the escapees had been shot while resisting arrest. The number soon rose to 50. The camp fell into a state of profound, absolute shock. The men knew the excuse of resisting arrest was a lie. 50 men do not die in 41 separate incidents without a single one being merely wounded. The realization that their friends had been murdered in cold blood transformed the camp into a place of mourning. The Luftwaffe guards themselves were horrified, some openly expressing their disgust at the actions of the Gestapo, distancing themselves from a crime that violated every law of war. In a rare gesture of humanity, the Luftwaffe permitted the prisoners to build a memorial. The men who remained behind used their skills once more, not for escape, but for remembrance. They designed a stone altar, a solemn structure where the urns containing the ashes of the 50 could be housed. Each urn was a heavy, cold vessel, carrying the weight of a life cut short. The names were etched into 3 stone tablets: Bushell, Bull, Kirby Green, and 47 others. They came from Britain, Canada, Australia, Poland, and across the globe, united finally in this quiet corner of a Polish forest. For years after the war, the memorial stood as the only marker of the tragedy. Even as the camp was liberated and the survivors returned home, the shadow of the 50 remained. Eventually, a team from the Royal Air Force Special Investigation Branch, led by Wilfred Bowes, began a relentless hunt for the killers. They spent years tracking down the Gestapo agents across a broken Europe, ensuring that those who pulled the triggers on those lonely roads would eventually face the justice they had denied their victims. The legacy of Stalag Luft III is not just found in the daring of the tunnels or the ingenuity of the forgers. It lives in the memory of those 50 men who never saw the end of the conflict. Of the 76 who crawled through the darkness of Harry, only 3 made it to the safety of neutral ground. Per Bergsland, Jens Mueller, and Bram van der Stok reached their homes, carrying the story of the Great Escape to the world. Today, the forest near Zagen is quiet. The sand has reclaimed the tunnels, and the trees have grown tall over the paths where the cars once stopped. But if you listen closely to the wind through the pines, you might still hear the echo of 1,000 footsteps in the dark, and the whispered promise that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.